Welcome. It is Verdict with Ted Cruz, the week in review. Ben Ferguson with you. And here are some big stories that you may have missed that we talked about. First up, the killing of Christians in Nigeria is happening at a shocking rate. The media and the world not talking about it. We're going to shine a light on it and make sure that you know what you can do to help. Also, there is a crackdown on Christians in China. Why is this happening around the world? We'll give you the details on that and how we can also use our U.S. government to help stop it. And finally, we now know what the Biden administration was doing when it comes to spying on conservatives, including even more members of Congress. This time, they asked for the phone records and text messages of Senator Ted Cruz. It's the Weekend Review, and it starts right now. I want to move now, Senator, to something that you've been spearheading and leading on. It's certainly not getting attention in the media, but you're wanting to hold Nigeria accountable for the 50,000, let me say that number again, 50,000 Christians that have been killed there. Explain why this story is so important and what you're trying to do, and also why is no one covering this as it's been described to me?
Look, it is truly horrific. The numbers are stunning. The numbers are staggering. Here are the top line numbers of what we're seeing. We have seen over 50,000 Christians killed. We have seen over 18,000 churches and at least 2,000 schools burned. And the response to this, the Nigerian government is fighting back ferociously, saying this is not happening, this is not true. There's a battle. The Nigerian government officials are getting very angry that I'm calling them out. I want to read to you from the executive summary of the U.S. State Department's 2024 country report on human rights practices in Nigeria. And here's what it says, quote, significant human rights issues included credible reports of arbitrary and unlawful killings, disappearances, torture, or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, arbitrary arrest or detention, serious abuses in a conflict, serious restrictions on freedom of expression and media freedom, including violence or threats of violence against journalists, violence or threats against labor activists or union members, and significant presence of any of the worst forms of child labor. Non-state actors committed arbitrary and unlawful killings, disappearances, physical abuse, and other mistreatments. Boko Haram and the Islamic State in West Africa continued attacks on civilians, military, police, humanitarian, and religious targets. Unlawfully recruited and forcibly conscripted child soldiers, and carried out scores of attacks on population centers in the northeast regions. Abductions by Boko Haram and the Islamic State in West Africa continued. Both groups subjected many women and girls to gender-based violence, including forced marriage, sexual slavery, and rape. This is what's going on in Nigeria right now, and it is going on far too often with the acquiescence of the elected government officials. Far too often, and in some instances, you have provinces in Nigeria that have on the books blasphemy law and Sharia law, and they will prosecute Christians for blasphemy. They will prosecute Christians for violating Sharia law, in which case the government becomes a tool of the persecution of Christians. And look, it is devastating. It is the most Christians being murdered anywhere on the face of the planet is happening in Nigeria. And so I introduced legislation to require the Secretary of State to designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern and to impose sanctions, including in particular sanctioning the individual government officials. So if you're a local official and you're enforcing blasphemy laws and Sharia laws and you're persecuting Christians, or you're turning the other way and turning a blind eye to Christians being murdered in mass numbers, the result of my legislation would be each of those individual government officials would face sanctions. And I got to say, the Nigerian government has been pushing back ferociously. For example, the chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, Oluwole Oke, said the Cruz bill is, quote, a deliberate attempt to damage the Nigerian image. And he insists Nigeria is a very tolerant country. Well, other than murdering 50,000 Christians. Very tolerant other than that. Likewise, the Minister of Information and National Orientation, Muhammad Idris, rejected the suggestion that, quote, any Nigerian officials will willingly, deliberately indulge in the act of siding with violent extremists to target any particular religion in the country. Likewise, presidential spokesperson Baya Onanungo demanded that Cruz stop his, quote, malicious and contrived lies against, quote, my country. And finally, Senate President Godswill Akpabio cautioned against framing the crisis, quote, along religious lines, since, quote, terrorists and bandits target Nigerians indiscriminately, regardless of faith. Now, listen, it is certainly true that Boko Haram and other religious radicals in Nigeria are killing Muslims as well. They're killing both. But they are systematically targeting Christians for mass murder. When you've got 50,000 Christians being murdered, that is not accidental, that is not random. And the over 18,000 churches and the over 2,000 schools, they are singling out and targeting Christian churches and Christian schools and burning them to the ground. And the government of Nigeria is not acting with any vigor at all to defend and to defend the Christians or just to keep them alive.
Yeah, to keep them alive. And so now, obviously, this is about shining a light on this. And then you go back to the policy aspect of this. What happens next? And for people specifically that are listening, what do they need to be doing and advocating for to make sure that we can move this forward?
Look, the next step needs to be that I'm pushing for the Congress to pass my legislation. I'm on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so I'm pressing for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to take it up. That would designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. Now, I would note the Trump administration can do so on its own, and this is often the case in foreign policy areas where I'll introduce legislation and I'll push for action. So, for example, I've introduced legislation to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. I've done so repeatedly in multiple Congresses. I think it is unequivocally a terrorist organization. In fact, Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, is what they call themselves. And that has not yet happened, but I would like to see Congress pass my legislation. But the most likely way we'll get the Muslim Brotherhood designated is that I will succeed in convincing President Trump and the Trump administration to do so. And I've been making that case vigorously. With respect to Nigeria, the same thing is true. I'm going to try to pass the legislation, but I'm also very much making the case to the Trump administration. They have the authority to do it now. And look, I want to point out, you asked what people can do. Speak out. Highlight 50,000 Christians massacred since 2009, the single greatest mass slaughter of Christians anywhere in the world. And look, here's how Fox News put it, quote, a diplomatic battle is being waged between leading Republican Senator Ted Cruz and Nigerian government officials. The Texas senator has warned he will hold them accountable for the reported mass slaughter of tens of thousands of Christians in Nigeria. The officials say Cruz is lying, with one claiming that despite even the Pope publicly calling out the killings, there is religious harmony in the country. But you know what? Maybe you don't believe me. Maybe you don't believe the Pope. So if the Pope and I are both wrong, how about this? Maybe you'll believe Bill Maher. Give a listen to what Bill Maher had to say on this topic.
If you don't know what's going on in Nigeria, your media sources suck. You are in a bubble. Not, and again, I'm not a Christian, but they are systematically killing the Christians in Nigeria. They've killed over 100,000 since 2009. They've burned 18,000 churches. This is so much more. These are their Islamists, Boko Haram. This is so much more of a genocide attempt than what is going on in Gaza. They are literally attempting to wipe out the Christian population of an entire country. Where are the kids protesting this?
Thank you. No one will talk about it, so thank you.
Absolutely.
It's Africa. That's why no one's talking about it, and they should be. You can't read about it in mainstream media. It's sad, so thank you for bringing it up.
Well, because the Jews aren't involved. That's why. It's the Christians and the Muslims. Who cares?
He is exactly right, and I appreciate Bill Maher calling it out and shining a light on it. He's right that the corporate media does not want to cover it. And by the way, on that same show, someone you know well, Van Jones from CNN, he was on that show, and Van Jones is a very left-wing guy, and he's on CNN regularly, but he commented and he chimed in agreeing with Bill Maher. Here, give a listen to Van Jones talking about the slaughter of Christians in Nigeria.
You're talking about young people. A lot of them seem to know one thing. White people did some very bad things in this world, and they certainly did. But there are other things to know.
Yes.
Including
the fact that in Sudan right now, which nobody is talking about, you have Arab militia murdering people by the wheelbarrow, including the fact that Africa right now is being overrun by Islamist terrorists, including Boko Haram, with no conversation about that at all.
I did it last week.
Exactly.
Nigeria.
Yeah, Nigeria.
I mean, this is an actual planned genocide.
Yes.
I mean, they really want to kill all the Christians in that country, and they are systematically doing it.
And the fact that there's almost no response from the global left and no attention from mainstream media is a crime against African people, black people, and human rights. I agree with that 100%. It turns out that there's a double standard for Jews. That is true. No Jews, no news. As long as you can put the Jewish state in the conversation, it's going to be a big conversation. If you can't, you get no attention at all. This is a big problem.
It is a big problem. I mean, you hear Van Jones saying it.
Yep.
He is correct. It is a huge problem. No Jews, no news. Like, I mean, it's amazing that this is happening.
Look, we see the protests on college campuses. We see these angry leftists who are completely enraged about Gaza. The instant President Trump negotiates a peace deal, they go away. Now, Hamas is executing Palestinians on the street, lining up Palestinians on their knees, shooting them in the back of the head, and not a peep. These leftist radicals, they are perfectly fine with Palestinians being systematically murdered as long as it's Palestinians. As long as Hamas doing the murder, you don't see a protest. You don't see any calls of genocide. Their protest is about one thing, which is they hate Israel and they hate Jews. And I got to say, where is ABC? Where is CBS? Where is NBC? Where is CNN and MSNBC? Where's the New York Times? Where's the Washington Post about the mass murder of over 50,000 Christians in Nigeria?
Now, if you want to hear the rest of this conversation, you can go back and listen to the full podcast from earlier this week. Now on to story number 2. Senator, it's time for us to talk about China, and a lot of people are talking about the economic issues with China, sanctions and tariffs. The subject we're about to talk about is one I hope people share everywhere on social media. This is why we do this show, and it's so important. And this is what's happening in China, cracking down on Christianity right now, and is not being talked about enough.
Well, Communist China has a terrible record when it comes to religious liberty and religious persecution, and in particular, the persecution of Christians. And China has for decades persecuted Christians in China. But recently, they've been cracking down, and it's been getting worse. So here's how I put it to Fox News this week. The Chinese Communist Party is conducting yet another sweeping crackdown on Christians, and they're again targeting Pastor Jin and the Zion Church. The CCP fears anything it cannot directly control, perhaps most of all, faith. The United States has powerful tools to provide protection and relief to people facing persecution and violence, and we should use those tools unless and until China releases the members of the Zion Church. And what has happened is China arrested several Christian leaders, including the pastor of one of the country's biggest underground evangelical churches, and that's Pastor Jin Mingri, whose children are U.S. citizens. Grace Jin, who is Mingri's daughter, was very kind, but went out of her way to thank me for fighting to release her father from prison. And here's what Grace Jin said. She said, quote, "His efforts demonstrate that the world is watching on as the Chinese government unjustly imprisons pastors and church leaders for the peaceful exercise of their faith. Thank you to the leaders here and abroad for all the support and solidarity."
And Senator, this is I think the part that's so frustrating for me and so many listening is this has been happening for so long, and because so many countries do business with China, they have deliberately looked the other way because they're basically saying, hey, we'd rather just get along and do trade and get cheap Chinese goods than actually hold them account for what they're doing to Christians.
Well, that's happening far too often, and we've discussed before on this podcast the persecution, the mass murder of Christians in Nigeria. Nigeria, the most Christians are murdered for their faith of any country on earth, and I've been leading the effort to hold Nigeria to account. Well, in China, likewise, for my entire time in the Senate, I've been vocal speaking out for Christians being persecuted in China. And this crackdown, actually, next week, President Trump is going to Asia and is gonna meet with President Xi of China. And so just this past week, I introduced a bipartisan resolution condemning China's persecution of Christians in particular and Pastor Jin. And I was joined by Chris Coons. Chris is a Democrat, and Chris is someone who cares deeply about religious liberty. And so we joined together with a bipartisan resolution calling on China to release Pastor Jin, to stop targeting the Zion Church, to release the pastors and the Christians who've been imprisoned, and to cease engaging in persecution of religious liberty writ broadly and of Christians in particular.
It really is one of those that is frustrating. And now this comes back to the issue of leverage. Is this going to be enough leverage to possibly see a change here? Because one thing that we've learned is China only responds when their pocketbook gets hurt. And if they don't think we have the political will to stand up for Christians, then they're going to continue to persecute them no matter what. That's just their MO.
They are, but they respond to pressure. They respond to pressure in two forms. Number one, to being publicly called out, to having light shine on their oppression. And number two, they respond to economic leverage. And President Trump is very effective at employing economic leverage. I think we should do both. Our bipartisan resolution is aimed at, quote, expressing condemnation of the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Christians and reaffirming the United States' global commitment to promote religious freedom and tolerance. And it also includes a demand that the Chinese Communist Party respect the human right to freedom of religion and end all forms of violence and discrimination against religious minorities. And the resolution notes, the CCP's actions mark the largest coordinated nationwide crackdown against a Christian urban house church in more than 40 years. It also notes that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom designated China as a country of, quote, particular concern for religious freedom every single year since 1998. And Pastor Jin of the Zion Church was detained by Chinese authorities. And indeed, that came as nearly 30 Zion Church pastors and workers were likewise detained or went missing across Beijing, Shenzhen, Shanghai, Chengdu, Beihai, Jingxing, and Huangdou. And I apologize for my Chinese pronunciation.
We'll forgive you.
But here's what Grace Jin said about this, and she's Pastor Jin's daughter. One after another, they were also taken, detained, like they were saying that they were people outside the doors, then one at a time, they were taken into custody. This is wrong. And President Trump has an opportunity when he is in Asia, when he is with President Xi, to call on President Xi to release these pastors, release Pastor Jen, release the Christians who are being persecuted, and stop persecuting people of faith. And I think the United States has a responsibility to be a voice for religious liberty across the country, to defend Christians when they're persecuted, to defend Jews when they're persecuted, to defend people of faith all across the world. You look at radical Islamic terrorists, many of them target and persecute other Muslims who are not violent. And I think religious persecution is wrong regardless of who the victims are. And we should be a voice for religious liberty. Now, that doesn't mean that America should go and invade China to try to break the pastor out of jail, but there are lots of tools that the president can use, including the bully pulpit of the presidency, including shining a light, and including also economic leverage to try to stop this persecution. And I very much hope President Trump will do so in the coming week.
Yeah, you and I both hope that. Final question on this. As you watch President Trump put pressure, not just on China, but other countries, it does seem to be that his foreign policy now is, if there is a wrong that needs to be discussed, it's going to be on the table front and center. That is pretty different from what we've seen in past administrations where they're like, well, maybe it's not the time to bring that up right now. He seems to be wanting to bring it all up.
You're absolutely right. And strong American leadership can stand up to tyrannies. The Soviet Union was terrified of Ronald Reagan. That's how we won the Cold War without firing a shot. And Communist China and our enemies across the globe are terrified of Donald Trump. And that's why we're seeing such major national security improvements right now.
As before, if you want to hear the rest of this conversation on this topic, you can go back and download the podcast from earlier this week to hear the entire thing. I want to get back to the big story, number 3 of the week you may have missed. All right, Senator, so let's start with the big news. Where were you when you found out that you were spied on as part of Jack Smith's investigation into Donald Trump? This clearly is a fishing expedition. Yep. And what were you told? Have you been briefed on this, or are you just getting the same intel we are from reading it in the news?
So I found out about this last Thursday. I got the information. And let's back up a couple of weeks ago. A couple of weeks ago, the news broke that Jack Smith, the prosecutor in the Biden DOJ that was going after January 6th, that was going after President Trump, had subpoenaed 8 senators and 1 Republican House member and had gotten their cell phone records. And the 8 senators who had been subpoenaed were Marsha Blackburn, Ron Johnson, Bill Hagerty, Josh Hawley, Cynthia Lummis, Lindsey Graham, Dan Sullivan, and Tommy Tuberville. And then Mike Kelly, a Republican House member from Pennsylvania, was also subpoenaed. All 9 of them had their cell phone records handed over to the Biden Department of Justice. Now, I got to admit, just over a week ago, Sean Hannity was in town, and I had dinner with Sean, and with several of the senators on that list as well. And I was laughing with Sean. I was saying, I'm actually kind of offended. Like, how did I get left out of this list? Like, what did I have to do?
Dude, yeah, to make the list, right?
I was literally standing on the Senate floor on January 6th, objecting and leading the fight. And I had brought together 11 senators to stand together in fighting for an election commission to assess the evidence of voter fraud, and including many of the senators who were subpoenaed were in the group that I'd brought together. So I was joking with Sean, but I wasn't entirely joking. Well, it turns out the reason I was not on the list is apparently all 8 of those senators, their cell phones are with Verizon. And the evidence had come out that Verizon had handed over their cell phone information. Well, my cell phone is with AT&T, and I didn't know it at the time, but I found out late last week that Jack Smith sent a subpoena to AT&T demanding my cell phone records, and AT&T told him to go jump in a lake. AT&T did not give my cell phone records. I really, look, AT&T is based in Texas. I'm proud of them. They did the right thing. I appreciate that. And they assessed it. They had a subpoena from Jack Smith. By the way, the subpoena called for, quote, detailed records for inbound and outbound calls, text messages, direct connect, and voicemail messages, among other things. So they were seeking that. There was also an order from Judge Boasberg, who was, this left-wing judge who's been presiding against over much of the litigation against Trump, had an order from Judge Boasberg ordering AT&T, you cannot disclose to Cruz that we're seeking his cell phone information for a year.
Isn't that amazing, by the way? Hey, you sitting United States Senator, don't tell him. We don't want him to know.
Yes. And so AT&T examined it, and they came to the conclusion. Now, the way it works, so the subpoena just comes, and they get a cell phone number. So the Biden DOJ didn't identify who they were seeking. And by the way, look, the telecom companies, typically, if they get a subpoena for phone records on a number, they typically hand it over because it's usually a drug dealer, a criminal. You have a subpoena that's issued from a grand jury, so they will routinely in a criminal proceeding hand over. Well, it so happened that AT&T, even though they just asked for the number, they looked and realized whose number it was, and they talked with their legal team, and they said, listen, what Cruz is saying is and any member of Congress, what they're saying is protected by the speech and debate clause of the Constitution. The Constitution protects the ability of senators and House members to engage in debate, to do our jobs. Article 1 of the Constitution vests all legislative power in the Congress. And in fact, on January 6th, it was very literally speech and debate. As I said, I was standing on the Senate floor giving a speech and raising an objection. So it's literally the heart of what one does as an elected member of Congress. And so AT&T concluded, listen, we're not going to comply. As I said, I'm grateful for AT&T doing that, but that now makes it 9 senators that we know of and one House member.
So I'm guessing there might be other senators that were also at AT&T, and they probably said, no, we're not going to do that either, right? It would be Verizon just caved instantly and said, sure, here's everybody you're asking for. There could be easily, I would say, another 4, 5, 6 others. Who knows how many outside the Senate, right, that they could have asked for, that they could have said no to as well. And I would assume there was a lot of people on AT&T.
Well, and look, the Biden DOJ also went after the Republican Attorney Generals Association. It went after Turning Point USA. This was a massive fishing expedition, and this was a political persecution. Understand, Jack Smith was appointed special counsel to investigate and prosecute January 6th, 3 days after Donald Trump announced his campaign for re-election in 2024. Yeah. Literally 3 days later. So it was 2022. So it was 2 years after January 6th. They had not appointed anyone, and yet suddenly when Trump announces his campaign, they rush to appoint Jack Smith to say, go after Donald Trump because we want to stop the voters from voting for him.
Sure.
But 9 senators, that is 20% of the Republicans in the United States Senate. And I got to say, for the executive branch to engage in wholesale spying on their political opponents, and spying with, let's be clear, none of us engaged in criminal conduct. None of us engaged in anything remotely criminal, arguably criminal. This was political persecution. This was snooping. This is hoping someone said something.
So here's what I was going to ask you. What were they hoping to find, right? Like you go fishing, and what is the smoking gun in that scenario? They were just, hey, we'll just go after all these conservatives, and maybe we get lucky.
Look, I don't know what they were hoping to find, but they were asking for the cell phone records from January 4th to January 7th, so all surrounding January 6th. I assume they were looking for some modicum of coordination with those who engaged in active violence on that day. Part of their theory was the alternate electors that were being sent from various states, so I assume they were looking for some modicum of coordination there. But this was a political prosecution because they did not have evidence, and so they said, well, let's go through their cell phone records and see if we can find something. And by the way, who knows if somebody had sent something stupid via text, had a voicemail, people, when you go through someone's emails, when you go through someone's cell phones, when prosecutors go looking for a crime, the nature of a fishing expedition is let's go look around. There's a book that was written decades ago that's called 3 felonies a day. And it talks about how the average American commits 3 felonies a day, that in our regulatory state, things are so complicated, things are so mired in complexity that you can violate, you step on a wetland in your backyard. And
Sure.
There's an old line that a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich.
Yeah.
That a prosecutor goes in front of a grand jury. When a prosecutor goes in front of a grand jury, there's no defense attorney there. It's just the prosecutor and members of the grand jury. And so I don't know what they were looking for. I think they were looking for anything that could stick because this was a political prosecution.
Let me ask you this.
So, Ben, I just want to say I'm really grateful. They did not find the pictures you sent of me of you in a pink tutu, because I just think that it's not criminal.
All my Ivy League jokes that I send you about the Ivy League snobs. I mean, Jack Smith probably ended up going to one of those places. That could have been very bad for me.
It would have been, and I got to say, just the typos and misspellings that you have in your text, that alone would have been a little bit embarrassing too. So I'm glad none of that came out.
The good news is they're very hard to decipher when if it's in front of Congress. Like, it's what was Ben really trying to say, and I'm like, you're welcome.
I will tell you, Ben. I talked to AT&T today, and I said, look, you guys ought to start a marketing campaign of shift to AT&T. We'll protect your stuff. We don't kudos to them
like Verizon.
I don't have a good answer to that, but I did, and I didn't know about this until just a few days ago. So this was when the first news broke. I was joking that I felt excluded, but it wasn't entirely a joke. And then I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And
here we are. All right, final question on this. What is going to be the response from Congress? Will there be any to this, or is this just old administration abuse of power? It is what it is. We're going to move on. Or is there going to be a way to make sure, we have standards that this is not allowed to happen and that people are held accountable for this?
Look, I think we're going to see hearings. I think we've got hearings coming in the House. I think we'll see hearings in the Senate. I will tell you, the 9 of us who were targeted, we're talking to each other because we want to prevent this. We want to prevent a subsequent DOJ from doing this, from spying on their political opponents, particularly in Congress. The executive doesn't have the ability to go engage in spying on members of the opposing party in Congress. That is an abuse of power. It is politicization. And this entire effort. So this prosecution was called Arctic Frost, and I think this is going to be the Watergate of the Biden DOJ. I think it is a demonstration that Jack Smith was a partisan prosecutor who was drunk on power, and I don't believe Jack Smith made this decision on his own. I think the decision-making goes all the way up. I think it goes up to the Attorney General. I think it goes up to the White House. And so I expect, number one, some real investigation and hopefully transparency in terms of who approved let's go spy on members of Congress. And that I think we're going to work to have some real transparency on, and that I think we're going to look at real and concrete steps we can take to make sure this never happens again, because this kind of abuse...
Is there part of you that just thinks maybe this has just been going on and never really stopped after the famous FBI director that had files on everybody and people said, well, we won't have that again after Jaeger, and now it's they're just Wild West. You can do whatever the hell you want to if you're a Democrat and you're in charge. We can spy on the president, we can spy on the campaigns, we can go after people in the Situation Room and entrap them, we can try to go after their business associates and their kids and get them to turn against them. Eric Trump was talking about that on our show the other day. If you missed that show, people should go back and listen to it. He's they were literally trying to turn Donald Trump's own children against him, threatening that your life's going to be over and you're going to be in jail, so you better get a get out of jail free card. And now it's and we were also spying on senators. I'm assuming some congressmen will come out. Who knows who's there? Charlie Kirk said recently, before his assassination, it came out that he said during the campaign, we either win the campaign or I may go to jail. I actually believe now, witnessing what we've seen, that's not far off from reality at all.
Look, the left was willing to weaponize the Department of Justice and the FBI. As you know, I wrote an entire book entitled Justice Corrupted, How the Left Has Weaponized Our Legal System. And it talked about, it actually started with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon tried to do that. And you look at some of the harebrained schemes that the Nixon Justice Department came up with, including creating underground stings to get people to get people on film taking drugs and with prostitutes to use to essentially blackmail them and to go after their political opponents. I mean, it was grotesque abuse of power. And when that came to light, we actually saw an improvement, and there were a couple of decades where I think this receded and occurred far less. And then what Richard Nixon tried to do to the justice system, Barack Obama succeeded in doing. He came in as this almost messiah figure, and DOJ, Eric Holder as Attorney General, you had Lois Lerner at the IRS. They began targeting their political opponents, targeting anyone that they disagreed with, and also protecting their friends. During the Trump administration, the first term, they went underground, but they waged war on the president. These are the people that created fraudulent documents submitted to the FISA court in order to try to go after President Trump. They wanted to reverse the results of the 2016 election because they were furious that the American people elected Trump. And then during Biden, they were open, they were flagrant, they were out in the open, and they were abusing their power. And I think they felt that the ends justified the means, and anything was acceptable. And so I think we need to take real steps. Do I think this has been going on forever and ever? I don't. I certainly hope not. I'm not aware that it has. There's ancient history, but it took really, I think, under Biden to make it just as viciously partisan as it became.
Off.
Yes.
Yeah. Wheels came off and no one cared about the rules anymore, clearly. It's incredible. As always, thank you for listening to Verdict with Senator Ted Cruz. Ben Ferguson with you. Don't forget to download my podcast, and you can listen to my podcast every other day you're not listening to Verdict, or each day when you listen to Verdict afterwards. I'd love to have you as a listener to, again, the Ben Ferguson podcast, and we will see you back here on Monday morning.